Thank you very much. That was a terrific and inspiring panel. The floor is open. There are microphones on each side, so don't be shy. If you have a question you'd like to ask our panelists, please do so. While you're thinking about your questions, I'll throw one out there. Not a trick question, but maybe it will sound like a trick question. Given what you've done with your careers, what do you wish you had learned in graduate school that you hadn't been taught and that you might be taught at a place like MIT?
Well, I'll take the first one at that because I already told you what I would have liked to have been taught, which is how to write and do policy analysis writing. It's at least the time that I spent at MIT, the emphasis was on research papers, hopefully of a quality that it might even be submittable to some journal, and that's great, and that's very important. But if you want to write if you want to work in the policy world, that's the one thing nobody will ever read. So you have to figure out a way to take those ideas and present them in a different way. And I think just the way that Kath just said in general, how to think about packaging the ideas, that's the world we live in. The amount of information that is now available to policymakers is so extraordinary that if you don't get your point across in 400 words, hate to tell you, it's just not going to get across to the right people at the right time, particularly to top decision makers. So spending real time about how you communicate ideas is a critical thing that if you want to be part of the policy arena.
Well, I got a lot of good advice from Dick Solomon, and I wanted to mention him as a role model for me because he had been Lucian Pai's student, and then he was an academic, a China scholar, and is a China scholar, and then served in the Nixon National Security Council during the time that Henry Kissinger and Nixon were trying to reach out to China and establish relations with China. And then later on, he was Assistant Secretary in the East Asia Bureau of State. So I got a lot of good advice from him about how to be effective in government. And I think, you know, Bill Kaufman, and there are a lot of people here when I was at MIT, and there still are, who have served in government or are serving in government. And I have to say that those hints of how to be effective in government, personal ones from the trenches, are extremely valuable. And but of course, at the time, I had no idea I was going into government, so I wouldn't have sought them out.
I was reflecting on what Kathleen Hicks was saying about the breadth of the training we received here, and I think I really can't think of something I would rather add to it, but I can think of a couple of things I'd like to take away. And one of those was the amount of time. I was, in fact, just looking through my old files from graduate school and throwing out a lot of tests and essays and notes and things that have been sitting there for 35 years. And that was the amount of time we spent crunching numbers for budgetary reasons having to do with planning strategic forces or forces in Europe. And a lot of that had to do with running simulations as to how many forces of what reliability and strength you needed to vaporize the Soviet Union's strategic forces, or what it would take them to vaporize NATO's conventional forces should the next war in Europe erupt. And even at that remove, it was sort of disturbing to read how much effort we put into that, and that was how you needed to do it if you were rationally planning forces. As we know, those kinds of forces were really not rationally planned, but if you were to do it, that's how you do it. I'd rather unlearn it.
I don't think there's anything part of the problem is I had a master's degree before here, so I'm mixing the two together, and I don't want to attribute things learned there necessarily makes sense in the MIT program. But so I don't want to say that. I will say, however, that I think MIT probably could go more out of its way on leadership skills for students. That's by far the biggest thing I look for when I hire people. It's by far, I want to make sure they can write for sure, but do they function well in a team, and can they lead? And can they lead from below, right? Because people think lead means you're at the top of the pyramid. It doesn't. So I see that in other schools. I won't name them because it'll just make you angry. So I would just say I think you could come up with ways for students to collaborate more and lead more in team environments.
So we've got two questions over here. I can't see your names at this distance, but please go ahead and ask.
Yeah, thank you, Folly. My name is Paul Walker. I was actually here 73 to 78. I got my PhD in 78, and I can so identify with this panel very much. But I really remember all the wonderful years. The 5 years I had here, I remember very fondly with Bill Kaufman. I was Bill Kaufman's research assistant. So I can identify with your comments there, Bill, on strategic affairs and first strikes and second strikes and third strikes and all the rest. I was also Bill Griffith's research assistant, and as we say, Wild Bill. Yeah, and I helped Bill write a book on German Ostpolitik. But I had a wonderful time here. I really enjoyed it, and I've spent the last 23 years with one foot in government, one foot in the NGO community, and one foot in academia. So that gives me 3 feet, I guess. But and commuting back and forth for the last 23 years to Washington, D.C., so I can understand and very much identify with everything you're talking about. I had a specific question for Ivo. Given that, Ivo, you were, well, first of all, say hello to Alyssa for me, but given that you were in NATO, I think 2009 to 2013, so you were there pre-Crimea and Ukraine and in the early Obama years and the immediate post-Prague speech for abolition of nuclear weapons efforts. Was there any discussion about pulling tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe? And if not, why not? And why haven't we been successful in reducing tactical nuclear weapons in Europe to date?
Yeah, I was there from 09 to 13. I proudly say that the Russians invaded one country before I got there and another after, but not when I was there. It's a very good question, and I joined in part the administration and worked during the campaign on the nuclear weapons policy part. And I spent a lot of time with then Senator Obama and others to figure out how we could move the envelope, and getting rid of tactical nuclear weapons was very high on that list. So it was an actually explicit part of what we were trying to do. The reality is, and people always know this when you get into government, it just is harder than you think. It's not just about good analysis, because if good analysis were to win every policy debate, you know that the world will be a very different place. But you have to work through a bureaucratic system in order to figure out a way to move forward. So, and I have a debate with Steve Fetter, for example, about this. I mean, I came to the conclusion that if you pushed too hard for getting rid of nuclear weapons early on, the government would, the bureaucracy would so resist that you would, in fact, reassert the importance of these weapons. So I spent time at NATO very deliberately in working within the interagency process to de-emphasize the importance of the weapons. And if you look at the strategic concept that we put together in 2010, and then we did another statement in 2012 on the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, everybody said, well, you know, you didn't get rid of nuclear weapons. I said, well, look at what's not there. And what's not there is there's no more statement in any NATO document that makes nuclear weapons in Europe central to either deterrence or defense. It's gone. It's removed. Now, there are statements that allow people to say they're still central to deterrence and defense, but they're removed. So the hope was that maybe in the second term, and there was a big debate in government, the speech that the president gave in Berlin in June of 2013, on whether he would call at that point for the elimination of tactical nuclear weapons. In Europe, he, in the end, decided not to do that. That's why he's president, but he had the option in front of him. And he could have decided the other way. Now, given what happened in 14, it wouldn't have happened. But it would have laid down at least a presidential proclamation that that was a goal. We didn't quite get there. It's going to take some time before we get back to that.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, or presentations, I should say. I walk away a little bit depressed because here's what I heard. No more than 400 words in the memo. At most 5 points on the PowerPoint slide before the invasion, with maybe 3 words per point. And an acceptance of, or at least an understanding of, the constraints and limitations that are part of the environments that you work in. The question here is that when you're sitting in graduate school or teaching, we're actually going over trade-offs and not single points. The trade-offs are often shifting. We're dealing with significant uncertainty. We're dealing with models that may only be partially true, with attention to the boundary conditions. And those are the kinds of points that are extremely difficult to get across in 5 points or 400 words. It's even worse when we consider the possibility that you're reacting and responding to crises. You don't really have control over that. And at the same time, we do wish to be learning from experience over time, learning how the trade-offs are shifting, or learning about what is or is not to be valued. So the question here, and it's maybe an appropriate one for the end of the day, how or what recommendations do you have for altering the environments that you operated in while in government to allow, if not graduate seminars to take place, let's be reasonable, but to allow for more attention to trade-offs, to learning, more serious acknowledgement of uncertainty, or a serious acknowledgement of error in earlier presuppositions and the need to move on?
I'd be happy to start. My first thing would be to say, don't be depressed at all. I mean, I think what you heard here is a realistic depiction of the need to bring these communities together if you're going to get the best out of, what the American Academy can bring to bear. So I'd say you start at the human capital level. You start at the human level. Who are the people who populate these offices? How do you make sure that each generation individually, if you will, if the human is the unit, has that kind of training, background, discipline, cultural proclivity to engage outside? And again, that's a lot of what is trained here. The second, and obviously it has to be done on, this institution alone cannot do that, so it has to be done more broadly. The second thing I would say is I think it would be fair to say that most people who focus on this issue in Washington, the first thing they want to talk about is the National Security Council. I have come to believe that although National Security Council reform is always a good thing, that is the wrong place to look to solve the problem. And that if you want to have an institutionalized approach to ensuring systematic use of red teams, net assessment efforts, long-term strategy development, you need to build that below that level, and that will require leadership teams that want to create, house, and protect those institutions, and then find ways to link them to sources of power. And so individual leadership becomes very important. Go back to point one. So there are such institutions in government. You have everything from the National Intelligence Council has a futures office, for instance. You have folks inside you have a policy planning shop in the State Department. You have the equivalent in the Defense Department. You have an Office of Net Assessment in the Defense Department. You have all those kinds of organs throughout government. But how do you sort of take those silos of activity and net them into a whole. And there have been periods of time where it has been done better than others, but I think that's really where the focus should be. How do we institutionalize an effort there? One thing I often say when I go up to testify to Congress, this always comes up, why can't the government think strategically? And I always try to turn it back on them to say, when was the last time you had a hearing on a strategic issue? You have an annual budget hearing, right, for the Defense Department, for instance. Do you have an annual strategy hearing where you ask the Secretary of all Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to come up and not talk about the F-35 program per se, but talk about strategy? And sometimes they do. They do it occasionally, but they don't do it annually. So I think you can look every which way in government and see areas in room for improvement. But I wouldn't feel hopeless about that. I just think it's not a structural, easy, fixed, statutory thing. It's much more about leadership and processes and training.
If I can add, I agree completely with Kath on all of those points. Let me add, I think there's an organizational dimension too. So I wrote a book about the National Security Advisors and went back to Bundy through Rice. No, actually, first the other Rice, Condi Rice. Haven't done the Donald Rice piece yet. And you know what has always struck me, and if you read history, is the depth in which certain issues used to be debated and they no longer are. They used to be strategic and they become very tactical. And I think there is one piece that sort of forces the move from strategic to tactical, and which is organizational. There are just too many people in the White House working these issues. And Brent Scowcroft used to say that he woke up every day and looked in the mirror and said, don't hire another person. Because the temptation is in the White House, is to say there's a problem out there, I don't have enough people, let me hire another person to take over that problem. Well, that person is going to take over the problem, but then going into the agencies and start to tell them how to do things, and pretty soon you have tactical micromanagement and you lose strategic perspective. So the micromanagement, which everybody complains about, what's lost is the fact that there's no strategic perspective. And you know, it wasn't that long ago. In fact, it was 1989. There were only 50 staffers in the National Security Council. My law of NSC staffing is that every administration, it doubles, and it turns out it works. Under Clinton, at the end, it was 100. Under Bush, it's 200. It's now 400. Don't tell me that it's 8 times more complicated today than when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Cold War was ending, we were starting a war with Iraq, and the economy was tanking at the same time. Don't tell me that that wasn't a complicated time, but somehow George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft and 50 people were able to manage the process. Oh, by the way, a transition from the Cold War without firing a shot, and that opened up the prospect for the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe and much of the Soviet Union. Not a bad sort of strategic move on the foreign policy side that was enabled, it seems to me, by having people who thought strategically. We're forced to think strategically because if all you can do is if you only have 50 people, then you have to ask the big questions. You don't have the time to ask the small ones, and that's what we do now. That's the problem, I think, from an organizational perspective, and it will change. And now we have 15 deputies meetings on what to do, who to arm in Syria, and we still don't get it right. In fact, we probably don't get it right because we have 50 meetings on who to arm in Syria.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the panel. We've got a bit over time, so I'm sorry that we can't get to all the questions, but it's been a terrific session.
Well, we've come to the end of our time here today. Just a few quick comments. First, I do want to thank all the speakers from throughout the day for their reflections and their telling us about their wonderful and fascinating experiences. I think the only conclusion that I can draw after today is that the MIT Political Science Department really is truly a singular institution. between the strands of history that we've heard today, all the way through the accounts of contemporary research in the department, there's such a strong DNA, asking big questions, the importance of theory, the questions be relevant, oftentimes policy relevant, methodological pluralism, use the best methods for the question that you're asking. People doing work here that can't be done anywhere else, either because it's interdisciplinary or policy relevant, or literally can't be done anywhere else. In the case of someone like Chris Warshaw, there's just the computing power and the manpower needed. There's a phrase that gets used about another unit at MIT that I think we should adopt for us, that we here are innovators who don't ask permission, that just go ahead and pursue these projects. So just the independence and the intellectual integrity that was on display today with people's accounts was just really inspirational to me. Just a couple quick things. I should add that the 50th celebration continues online. Throughout the academic year, we plan to continue to profile faculty and alums, so be sure to check out our website. And one final exhortation to the alumni: please keep in touch with the department. Let us know who you are. And the alumni office is actually the chief portal for us, so that's the way that we can principally reach you. So make sure that your information is always updated with the MIT alumni office. And finally, thanks again to everyone who participated today and who attended today. Here is to our first 50 years and our next glorious 50 years. Thank you all.